Yours. All right, we're live. It's Hangops for May 9th, 2014. It's been a couple weeks since I've been here. Been shaking things up a little bit, but glad to be back in the saddle. Big shout out to Chris Weber for holding down the fort in my couple absences, and also to Andrew Clay Schaefer for pitching in a couple weeks ago. It's good that we got a nice family of hosts here. So, yeah, today we wanted to talk about thought. What? No, not thought leadering. Sorry, I'm reading IRC while I'm trying to talk. We want to talk about remote and distributed working thought leadering, not just any thought leadering. Yeah, so kind of dovetails nicely with which if you didn't catch on Twitter or my blog post, I started at Lookout last week.
Oh, Jason's here. Oh man, I've
All
had
right.
enough of
Anyway,
that.
so I started at Lookout Mobile Security on Monday. So it's my first week with them, and I'm going to be working remotely for them, and they're mostly based in San Francisco. So topical for me and for I think most of our panel. Why don't we do a quick round of intros, and if you would, tell a little about yourself and your sort of remote working status or experience briefly, and then we'll maybe hit some of the topics. Let's start with you, Pete.
Oh, hi everyone. I'm Pete. I just took a. I just landed from a red eye, and so I'm moving a little slow still. Yeah. So anyway, I'm Pete. And what was the question about my remote working experience?
Just who you are and
Oh, so I'm Pete. I would say I work at Dine, but I actually just gave my notice, and I'm going to be moving on to something else. So.
okay, cool. All right. I think Matthew's having some mic trouble. So Jason Dixon,
Hello.
he of the powdered wig. What's up?
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I also just got in from Red Eye. Yeah, I mean, I've been doing remote for a while. I'm actually in an interesting role right now as remote manager of our monitoring and analytics team in Dyn. Before that, I did remote at both GitHub and Heroku, and another small consulting firm out of New York called Endpoint. So I've got a fair amount of experience with it. Been pretty successful with it. I think done well. It's a great advantage for businesses that are willing to not just adopt it but embrace it, because it opens up a lot of recruiting opportunities.
Great. Frosty, who are you? Oh, you're muted, buddy.
Yeah. Sorry. Hey, I'm Frosty. I'm also a remote worker, although I work from a slightly more opulent location than a lot of people I know. And I apologize if I start slurring my words because I'm a ton of beers into the evening already, so that's what's up.
Well done, sir.
Mr. Weber.
So I'm Christopher Weber. I did a year and 4 months or so as an 80% remote worker at Demand Media. So I commuted into the office once a week, and now I am 100% remote at Chef.
Excellent. And Ben.
So my name is Ben Smith. I work at DreamHost. I've been working for them for I don't know, 8 or 9 months remote now. Actually spent 2 months working out of Asheville, North Carolina, totally out of my element with my dad. So that was a completely interesting remote working experience. And then before that, I worked for remote out of another company out of LA for about a year. So I'm close to a couple of years into this. I have tons of experiences and thoughts on the subject. So
Cool. And just for review, I was remote with Mozilla for about 2.5 years, and I'm going into remote again with Lookout. Let's lay a little groundwork, as they say. Let's define a couple things. First, so remote, right? I think the best way to think about remote working is there is a core of the company in one location. They have an office. somewhere where a majority, probably where the company got started. And as they go to a certain size, or they want to hire someone in particular, they start hiring a remote person. And remote is, you're working remotely. You're not in the office day to day. You're at your home. So that's sort of remote. It's kind of like one or a few people that are sort of independently in whatever their preferred location is. Maybe it's home, maybe it's a co-working space, maybe it's Panera Bread, whatever it may be. And then there's distributed, which is sort of multiple clusters of people in different locations. A common way companies become distributed is they open an office in Europe, they open an office in Asia, they have a North America office, they have a South America office. Or, maybe someone starts as remote and then recruits a few people in another location, and they all start working in the same co-working space or open an office. And, then you have two physical locations, but it's sort of like two physical clusters or more physical clusters of people. And many companies are a mix. Mozilla is a good example of a mix with, over a dozen offices, clusters of people, as well as a couple clusters of people that were in like a co-working space, but it wasn't a full-blown office. And then a couple hundred people that were full-time remote. So, you can see a mix of both. There are some challenges to each one. So with that, with sort of differentiating those two a little bit, why don't we start with remote, because I think probably more of us are remote and deal with remote challenges. So let's talk about that. Let's open with whoever has thoughts. Just dive in. I don't even know where to start. So someone start.
Well, so it's interesting. I guess I'll start with the remote as being the remote guy on a team. It really does make a significant difference when the entire team is remote or a good percentage of the team is remote versus like being the remote person on a team. And I can't stress that enough. I think you can make it happen, but it is a lot of work. And where you really run into issues is when you're dealing with external teams that, everybody else is in the office, so they forget about you because, for whatever reason. So it's really interesting to kind of make that distinction and understand what you're walking into ahead of time. In fact, arguably, there were a number of people when I looked at moving to demand that were very much so of the opinion that I shouldn't do it at all because it was 80% remote, not 100% remote. So kind of an interesting thing to think about. Has anyone else on the call been partially remote or just always been fully remote?
So I guess I'm the kind of a weird outlier because I've been in the opposite mode of managing like fully remote teams, which I think it's an interesting challenge that I'm kind of surprised that more people don't kind of go that route just because of the quality of the people that you can hire when you go like straight remote like that. I mean, your pool opens up so wide.
Oh, for sure. And it's always funny because you look at, and not to give the folks at Demand Media a hard time, but they're an awesome company to work for, but they limit their talent pool. Frankly, by wanting people in the office, and more importantly, the office in Santa Monica, you limit yourself heavily because there are people that live on the west or the east side of LA that are like, screw this, I'm not going to sit in an hour and a half of traffic to go into an office.
Okay, so why do employers traditionally want people in an office in the sort of quote-unquote information age?
We actually touched on this a little bit in the European Hangops session a couple weeks back, talking about some of the how startups in Europe are maybe a little bit different from startups in North America in particular, and in how in Europe remote working is just, it's not really a thing that's very evolved. It's not very done. So one of the things that we touched on was this idea of office culture, this idea of getting people into one place at one time so that you can all sort of exchange ideas, and then you can build a team, and that you can learn to trust each other, and that you can just have these sort of little conversations around the water cooler that spark into big ideas. And so I don't want to pass a value judgment on it saying, oh, this is the traditional way and that maybe the new way is better or whatever, but there's a certain, I think, natural ease in collecting people in one place at one time. Human beings are social creatures. We've been sitting around campfires since time immemorial. It's a natural thing for people to do, is to all be in the same place at the same time working towards the same goal. So I would say at a really basic level, that's why you would want to have not remote workers.
Well, and it's interesting. There are a lot of people that don't know how to work remote, and that like we default to thinking people know how to work in an office, which is funny because I would argue that most people struggle that it's that you're right. It's like this is the default mode of operation, so of course it's the right way. And arguably, one of the things I used to tell my boss is my 1 day a week in the office is the least productive day of the week. Yes, I get a few more I get more conversation time in with people, but and there's something nice about being able to get in a room and whiteboard things, but compared to what the amount of work I got done every other day of the week, it was just insane. Like, and even crazier than that was the day I was in the office, I worked more hours because I normally got into the office at roughly 5 a.m. and didn't leave until 6 p.m. with maybe half an hour for lunch. So.
I know from my perspective, so just to give to frame what I'm about to say, I do work in an office with other people that are employed by my company, but I'm the only person on my team, and almost everybody else on my team is a remote worker elsewhere. A handful of them are in offices, a lot of them aren't. So that's the frame I'm coming from. When you say that it's sort of this natural default that people work better in offices, or that is debatable. You're correct. What's interesting though is what you said about it being your least productive day is the day you spend in the office, and I found that also to be true. But I wonder kind of why that is. Is it because you're being distracted more by work-related things, or you're being distracted more by not work-related things? Are you getting interrupted because you're in the office? Like, I kind of want to delve into that a little bit. For me, when I come into the office, it becomes less productive simply because I'm not in the office very often. And so people want to go for lunch, and they want to play ping pong, and they want to grab a drink, and all this stuff. If I was in the office more often, I suspect those interferences would be reduced.
I think it matters on how you measure the production you're describing. I mean, I get up to Manchester maybe once a month, and for me, it actually is the most productive time, but not in terms of actually producing stuff as much as it is removing obstacles and freeing up resources. And that's because I can get face to face with people and kind of lean on them to get what I need. Whereas when you're remote, you don't really have that kind of you don't have that influence necessarily. So, but it's probably a different sort of situation.
Well, I'd like to echo both of those. I don't get out west very often, but when I do, it's kind of a weird balance. Sometimes I'll get less done the first couple of days because people want to hang out, they want to go get lunch, things like that. But then if I'm there for more than a couple of days, there are things that I can get done that just are not necessarily impossible to get done when I'm remote, but much easier to just be like, hey, dude, help me with this thing while I have you for 10 minutes in the same room. Like that, those are both things that I experience every time I'm in the office.
Well, and that's a great point, is the coordination aspect of things. Like when you're wanting to meet and whatnot, that was absolutely easier per se. But even then, I got to a point where the company invested heavily in making sure video conferencing was a thing in the various meeting rooms. So I got to a point that it really didn't matter whether I was in the room or not. It was absolutely a matter of whether or not they were in a proper meeting room. if that makes sense, because I could be just as effective as a member of the conversation in a meeting as long as the proper hardware was in place.
I'll agree with you there, but there's also something like, I don't know, maybe I'm weird and I speak more with like my whole body rather than just my head. But there's certain, like, I'm not sure if you noticed my hands are moving. Like there's an aspect of that I miss with people that I get out of being in the office as well. So just thinking about that, because I work for a company that also invested heavily in video conferencing, but it's just not the same. But yeah, I'm following you though.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with the personal distractions, because you've got friends there, you haven't seen them in weeks or months, and I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've been distracted by Pete pulling me out to play ping pong. That said, I think it's almost like
is that really how it goes? Come on now.
That's how I remember it happening. But I think it's almost like a well-run meeting. If you set an agenda and let people know what you expect while you're in the office for a visit, and then set aside some personal time, dinner out in the town, that night, time at the end of the day for ping pong or whatever it is, beers. I think you can be, I think you can be very productive.
So I have some recent perspective on this. I used to think that it was because I was not in the office frequently that it felt so disruptive and distracting. But I've been in New York for most of the past 3 weeks, so it's not like I haven't been here every day for a while. And I still find that I'm incredibly distracted compared to if I were at home working in my home office. Now, I also agree that there's a tremendous benefit in the bandwidth that you get from just dragging someone into a room and hashing out an issue. But this kind of goes back to your point, Jason. If you have an agenda set up and you have, these are the outcomes we expect to get out of this conversation, it's pretty easy to schedule, hey, let's jump on a hangout in 10 minutes or 5 minutes or right now if there's a room available. And I think that the tremendous benefit you get in terms of hiring reach and quality of candidates and access to candidates by working remote offsets every other downside to working remotely by such a wide margin that it's worth talking about, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of the benefits.
Someone's trying to talk.
Yeah, we can't hear you, Brandon.
Hardware mute. Okay. Sorry, I was sneezing. Okay, I'm going to make a statement that is a bold statement. I'm going to make it probably a little bolder than I feel it, but I'm just going to, so we could maybe rebut it or respond to it. In-office communication in engineering, sort of, technology-based companies who have access to all the tools that enable remote working, in-office communication becomes a dysfunctional crutch. It lets us keep bad communication habits that are actually detrimental to a company of more than, say, 2 or 3 people at a time, because it lets us maintain bad habits where we're not externalizing communication, we're not recording thoughts, we're not tracking action, we're huddling together, and then there's no follow through to document. And so it persists the sort of culture where someone joined and they have to go find the right shamans, right? The tribal shaman, that sort of analogy that Cliff Moon is fond of, right? You have to go and then oh wise master, please teach me how to SSH into this thing or that. So I think that's what it persists is those sort of bad habits, and that the things that are critical to make remote and distributed working successful are also habits that everyone needs to sort of get over that crutch of everyone of that FaceTime. What do you think?
I think you're preaching it, Brother Solars. I'm 100% in agreement with you, and I don't know if you said you're not feeling it. I'm definitely feeling it. I think that having people, even if everybody's in the same office, if everybody acts like they're a remote worker, there are net benefits to your whole communication stream. Asynchronous communication is an intensely powerful tool, not just internally, but externally if that's your bag. And not using it is a mistake, even if you don't necessarily feel like you need to. And I am feeling it, so that's my bold statement.
Yeah, you're totally right. And again, just to echo that, it's as a company grows, as you get to more than 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 or 250 people, the communication structures that may have worked when you were 5 people sitting around the same table, they were dysfunctional then. They're completely impossible as you grow.
It's interesting though because like I there you're hitting the nail on the head, but at the same time, it's amazing how hard it is to communicate that part to managers because I can think of situations where, so one of the things at Demand was I was absolutely expected to be at my computer from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day. Like that was the expectation minus lunch. And it was because people would drive by either my manager or someone else, and they would want and expect an answer right then and there, and they just weren't okay with async. It was they wanted an answer and they needed to be able to reach out to the right person at that point in time. And you guys are 100% right that by changing moving to an async nature of things, it means that it's not okay for docs to be out of date. It means that it's not okay for these conversations to not take place in tickets that you can go follow up with. And
yeah, I'm going to pile on that real quick. Tickets, not
it.
email. Don't use email. Use ticketing. Like email makes it too easy for it to be like one-to-one or one to a couple, not one to enough. Use ticketing.
The other thing that's kind of interesting about this as well is when you're trying to reconstruct failures, because your normal mode of operation is completely audio, you get on you get on a bridge and all of your communication is done audibly, which means you can't actually go back and figure out what the heck happened during that outage. So it's just this like vicious cycle of, yes, there's more bandwidth here, but do you really want more bandwidth to solve this problem? Endrant.
I think one of the interesting things what you were saying there, Brandon, and others about doing things in tickets instead of in email, is that with email you have a narrow focus of communication, and with doing it in some sort of an issue tracker, you have a potentially unlimited focus of communication. The difference there being that people can opt in to that participation. With email, if you're not on that distribution list, you can't opt in. With a ticket, if you're interested, you can. End of story. So right there, you're gaining something you didn't have with email, and if that's not enough to justify it, then y'all are not in the right game.
I'm glad you're in a better place now, Chris.
Not that I didn't enjoy working for Demand. It's just once you leave a situation like that, you're able to kind of take that step back and go, huh. Well, maybe this is where this was falling down, and maybe these kinds of things would help. And at the end of the day, I was a remote worker working with 3 different teams that there was no other remote person. So they didn't need these other forms of communication because it just wasn't part of their culture.
Yeah, and it's not that things cannot be done, and a lot of great things cannot be done within Office. That's certainly been the sum of a majority of even the progress in the technology industry has been people's in offices. But it's that there are new and better habits for us all to be creating and opportunities that aren't being missed because we're still operating with some of these modes that can be hampering in ways that are and sometimes subtle.
Yeah, I think one thing that we all do need to keep in mind, though, right? Working remotely is not a panacea. It's a skill, just like anything else, and it's a skill that you have to learn, and you're not going to be good at it on day one. And you have to understand, how it works best for you. Do you need a dedicated office space? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. I know people that works both ways. Do you need a set schedule for yourself? I don't know. It depends on the person. But it's how to do it. It's not something that you can just sort of dive into. I mean, you dive into it, but you're going to be bad at it.
Actually, why don't we talk about that for a little bit? I think it's an interesting thing you're touching on there. You have to learn how to work remotely. You know, like I said, sitting around campfires, that comes naturally. Working remotely, what can you do, or what can your manager help you to do to become an effective remote worker? What are some avenues to pursue?
Yeah,
So
I
I
think I
think for
touched on a
me, the
couple of them.
biggest
Sorry,
thing
go ahead.
was,
Go, Chris.
no, go for it, Mark. I think you actually have more experience than I do, so I'm curious as to what you think are a big deal.
Okay, so yeah, I think all I can go on is what works best for me, and I've been doing this for a long time, so I've sort of iterated on what works for me. I've worked remotely since 1999, so quite a long time. Um, so for me, I need to have a dedicated space in my house that is my office. I need to be able to close the door and know that my kids or wife are not going to come in when I'm in a conference call or when I'm in the zone on a project or when I just need to be head down. For me, it's useful to have not rigid hours, but sort of a routine, right? So I get up, I read my email, I have breakfast, I go sit down and work. It's not completely rigid, but I sort of have a routine that I know this is how my day is going to go. And I don't tend to, I know other people that do. I don't tend to intersperse other things in my day. I tend to just sort of go in my office and work as if I were in a physical office. I'm not going to say that works for everybody because I know a lot of people take off a couple hours and come back and it works great for them. But those are some things that work. I think it's useful to have expectations, personal expectations that the rest of the team can have for you. Like this is when Mark is usually around if I want to talk to him synchronously through chat. This is when he's usually around. It's not a contract. It's just sort of a expectation. So it's useful to have those sort of expectations and understandings of what everyone else on the team's work environment is.
I would say all of those are super reasonable, and it's interesting the time thing comes up because I've seen discussions online where people are like, absolutely not. If you're a remote worker, we're already giving you something. You cannot time shift. You will work the set hours that everybody else works, and obviously that doesn't work if when you're talking remote, you're in different time zones, but I'm right there with you. For me, I have a set space. I generally don't intersperse things. I do it a little bit as I need to because I now have that flexibility. But in general, I get up in the morning, I go work. I've got a couple of walks planned during my day just to make sure I'm getting my exercise in, and have that chance to think about things. But otherwise, I'm in my office. The other thing that I think that we're kind of skirting around is the with the team there has to be discussed like, no, the expectation is that you sit that you are in the chat room and have at least allowed yourself we have some mechanism that during the day when you're normally in the office we can do something to get your attention if we need to, type thing. Those are things that I run into where people are in in the office. It's like, no, really, like you need to have your chat window open so that if I need something from someone in the office or you need something of me, that you reach out, and that conversations get moved from waiting until I get into the office to let's have them in the chat room type things. But I'm right there with you. I've had buddies that were remote and it's like they just they got lonely. Like the lack of human interaction, like person to person interaction, actually caused them to almost go into depression. And it's like, okay, well maybe remote isn't your thing. So
one thing I don't hear talked about too much in terms of kind of tuning a remote situation is and this is something that I found I had to do have a lot of care in tuning was visits from a remote to the central office, and I think it's much more of a thing that needs to be well planned for someone who's remote and not distributed. You're not part of a distributed team. They're the remote member or the one or two remote members. But I found for myself that I prefer short, more frequent trips. But I've actually seen a lot of variants where there are others that I work with on separate teams, but for the same place where they actually prefer to only come once or twice a year for 2 or 3 weeks, and that works out a lot better for them. For me, I think that the visits, one of the functions that they provide for me is that while my teams are always in chat, and we do have a little bit of relaxation time in chat mixed in with the work. I feel like I kind of save up all that hallway chat that I would normally get being in the office, the gossip, the just emotional venting, that sort of thing. I kind of save it up, and having a every 4 to 6 weeks visit where I can go kind of unleash that and sync with the rest of the in-office culture is extremely valuable for me, and that's what prevents me from getting too lost in the woods and lonely, when I feel somewhat isolated.
So if I may interject, I got 2 things I'd actually tack on to that. One actually echoes Random's comment on IRC, which is that more trips doesn't always work if you have kids. It's just actually a brand new problem for me. I used to fly a lot, and now I'm like, oh, flying, I don't know.
I'll point out that I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old, and I think that 3 days every 4 weeks works far better than, say, 5 days every 8 weeks. The more frequent trips, the kids get used to it. My wife gets more used to it. We all kind of feel it coming. It's a little bit unintuitive that would be better than a longer trip. But if I spend, like for a hack week or something, I spend 5 days. Everybody, it just doesn't. I don't do it anymore because it just screws everyone up, just being gone for that long. But 3 days actually counterintuitively works a little bit better for the family thing.
And that actually builds on the second thing that I wanted to mention, which is that when I fly to go hang out with my team, it's an 11-hour flight. So I can't go for 2 or 3 days. It doesn't make
indeed, it's very dependent, and it's a lot of the variants I see as well in my own places. We have someone who lives in Florida who's like 2 hours from an airport, which will require 2 or 3 segments to get to San Francisco. So, it's something like 12 hours transit for him. So it's only possible for me to even do this because I work, or I live in a city that shares a hub, that shares several airline hubs with San Francisco, and I can get there in 6 hours door to door rather than 12 or 10 or whatever.
I think that also plays into the fact that you mentioned that your team, you're the remote member of your team and the rest of your team is localized. With fully distributed teams, it's still important to get together, but doing it every 4 or 6 weeks would just not work. Teams where I've done fully distributed, I tend to do sort of a quarterly or even only twice a year sort of schedule. I like to get everybody together 4 times,
the key takeaway. Okay, that's actually awesome. Mark hit the mute button, so I now know he's not talking. Because yeah, he's cutting in and out. Anyway, I think that's a key thing that we don't talk about is when you're going into a remote position. One of the things you need to do is have this discussion. What is the expectation? Because that's where the key comes in. Is you may find if you're jumping into a remote position that the expectation is that you're in, that maybe they want you in the office for a week, a month. That's probably not feasible for a lot of people. Yes, you're remote 75% of the time, but maybe they have expectations that don't fit your needs. On the flip side of that, maybe you need more frequent interaction, and the twice a year for a couple of days isn't enough either. The key being is that you need to have those conversations with the person you're going to go work with, and to be frank, it was something I had a huge amount of conversation with Nathan about, who's my boss, and just like, hey, what is the travel expectation? How much time do I need to spend in the air? And how much of it's going to require trips to the East Coast or to Europe versus, for me, I don't have a problem with a trip to San Francisco for the day because, frankly, it's no different than driving to Santa Monica. I get out to LA super early, get on a plane, get home late, but I'm still in bed and in my own bed, and more importantly, I've only missed one morning where my wife had to deal with the girls by herself.
And there's a little more to that conversation, right? It's not just also like if you're, if you're only remote or you're amongst a small percentage that's remote, how often are you going to be sort of at, HQ? But then also, right, like we talked earlier, the schedule. What is the expectation going to be from the sort of the on-site majority for you? Right, that's, I think, and your availability, I think, is actually probably the bigger piece, right? Because a trip once a quarter even is a little less.
That's actually one reason I like the frequent visits, is because as far as expectation of like when I'm going to be there next, I publish my trips to a calendar. I usually send out a little announce and stuff like that. But in general, since I'm there, every 4 or 5 weeks, if someone needs to meet with me or something, something where they're going to wait until I'm in town to create something, it ends up being, he was here a couple of weeks ago. He's probably going to be here in the next week or two, and people just kind of just get that sense, that frequency allows them to kind of get that sense that I'm going to be in soon. And it seems to just fall into place. So it's a little bit of a shortcut. It's a shortcut because in that I don't have to actually as actively plan or coordinate the stuff. But it's very convenient to actually have that happen.
So a couple things. One, I actually want to touch on something Mark pointed out, or sort of he didn't point out, but he sort of touched on, or whatever. Defining distributed also is everyone remote, no office. I sort of touched on it. Distributed is more like clusters of people, but that could be in clusters of one. So that's the other side of distributed, is there's no office, which I think consulting companies and smaller startups may do. Okay, so let's talk about how we start doing remote and how do we teach an organization to be better at remote? How do we teach an organization to be better at the communications practices that enable successful remote working, which we've also sort of presumed benefit the organization as a whole? So how do we teach the organization, and how do we teach the organization when we're remote?
I would say this plays into your interests very nicely, Brandon.
Correct.
Well, I don't mean to steal this away from other people who may have more experience in this, but since I started talking, I guess I'll keep talking. I think really trying to push asynchronous communication is a big step. I know I talked about that earlier. We talked about that a little bit, but honestly, it makes a big difference, and it's not easy. You got to work at it, and there's going to be people who are resistant to doing it. But if people just get into the habit of talking out loud on IRC, for example, right? I'm gonna pick one example. That's an example. So when I wake up in the morning, and it's the middle of the night for everyone I work with, I just do a stream of consciousness in our chat channel, where I'm like, oh, I'm looking into this. Oh, I wonder what this is. And then when people start to wake up, as the East Coast, so on and so forth through North America, they can look through that and get an idea of what it was that I was working on, and then start generating conversations. That is a thing you can do, and that kind of falls into asynchronous communication. Once people are into that habit, it starts to become easier to do other things as well. That's just one example.
It's interesting to note, just kind of as part of that, make sure your tools match what you're trying to accomplish. And nothing against IRC or Jabber, but you, in my not so humble opinion, you really should have something like HipChat or Slack or Campfire, or everybody has an IRC cloud account type thing where they can go review that, because like IRC is a perfect example. In order to get what I get with HipChat, you have to have a bouncer set up. You have to have this infrastructure in place so that you can actually scroll back through what that conversation was. and it used to kill me when you would come back and you'd see it would only replay the last like 10 messages, and you would get to the top and it's like, crap, there's what I actually care about is just a little higher type thing.
Yeah, so it sounds like Mark wants me to talk, so I figured I'd hop in. I actually like this conversation about the tool because at Dyn we had a like a Jabber server, and I think it was actually set up so that it would only keep a short amount of history, and obviously like that as we started to like try to build like more of a remote culture and allow for us to bring remote people in, we actually moved over to HipChat later on. We actually moved to Slack. We're actually really loving Slack because people can use their own clients and stuff like that. But a majority of the people at Dyn are in the office, so when you bring in a couple of remote people, there's a lot of conversation that can be missed. So the biggest thing that I was trying to do is try to put as much into the chat as possible, and kind of follow the chat ops kind of the mode of putting commits into chat and pull requests into chat and build fails into chat and really as much as possible, because what was happening before we did that is, chat would be empty and no one would be talking because you just get up and walk over to that person's desk. And then meanwhile, if you're at home, the people at home have like no idea what's going on. So, and it worked actually. I mean, it took a while because it's definitely like a, I guess a culture change. And so once people really started using it and putting the bots in there, and you could do cat bombs and animated GIFs adds to the fun. It people definitely come together. So I would basically repeat that anywhere else without any question. It just works.
So I'd love to hear Mark talk a little bit about chat ops at GitHub because he was there for all of that adventure, and what the positives and negatives were.
There are negatives. Yeah, I think it's almost universally positive. I think that I gave a talk at Velocity New York last year about chat ops. I think it reinforces even among. So if you're in a situation like I am now at DigitalOcean, so I joined DigitalOcean, I have a team that is built in New York today that I intend to hire wherever I find talented people. And the next few people I intend to hire are already remote, the people that I'm speaking with. So I am interested in sort of implementing a lot of the things that we had at GitHub, and I think it's a powerful tool for working remotely. It's also a powerful tool for getting the people that are inside the office to have incentives to use the chat system, right? So if all of your commits are in chat, if all of your deployment tooling is built around chat, if the tools that you use for incident response, like pulling graph data, for example, are in chat. If all of those things are in chat, then you have a powerful incentive for the people that are in the office to think about asynchronous work. And even beyond that, you get a lot of benefits around things like onboarding and knowledge transfer, and the chat backlog becomes your tribal shaman, as Brandon said. So I think chat ops I'm sort of hard pressed to find a negative. I mean, there could be some technological negatives around things like access control and those sorts of things, but they're just technological hurdles that you solve. But chat ops as a concept, I'm sort of hard pressed to find negatives, but I would love to hear if other people have different thoughts on that.
Who's going to write all that code? No.
You are.
Okay. I agree. I think one of the interesting things that some of the sort of rich text chat things offer is you can have, well, and GitHub sort of, I think, some of the chat ops talks. I'm in my mind, Jesse Newland's talk about this stuff at Monitorama last year, Monitorama Boston. You can have stuff fun with the emoji and the GIFs, and maybe your bot can do silly things. It brings back a little bit of that sort of sense of emotion that's lost through a text-only medium. I think that's a subtle sort of interesting upside. Also, just the GIFs part. Even Mozilla is based around IRC. I don't know. I think half my core competency was just posting and using GIFs. Right? It helps people have fun.
Yeah, it helps with that culture word that we all like to toss around. It's easy to say that you have a company culture when the culture is built by the way that people interact in the office, but you can build culture around chat just in exactly the same way. It's pretty funny. When I was at GitHub, there were times when I would go to, for example, the GitHub Summit where we brought all of the employees to the same place at the same time. And I would immediately have things in common with the people that I was meeting in person in Meet Space for the first time. And it got rid of all that awkwardness up front, right? It's just like, oh, hey Tim, how was that? That was I saw you cook some steak and you grilled out last weekend. How was that? And, it's just there's a shared context that you have when you really push all the communication and culture into the chat system and treat chat as the office.
You touched on the word culture and how that's getting kind of like, it gets thrown around. I think it's thrown around a lot right now. Oh, we got to maintain culture. This is our office culture, whatever. But like, I don't know if we're, as an industry, using that word properly. And maybe this is actually a little French-English divide thing, but my understanding of the word culture is that it's like the arts and expressions and manifestations of intellectual achievement as a whole within a particular subset of people, right? So when you talk about culture, it's not just playing ping pong. When you talk about culture, it's not just going out for some beers. It's literally the collective manifestation of the human experience for a subset of people. I don't know where I'm going with this, but so someone save me from myself, is what I'm trying to say. Culture is hard, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? You can't just fly people together and suddenly have culture. You have to work at it. It's something you have to cultivate, but it's also something that happens on its own. You can try real hard to get all of your employees to work 12-hour days and fail at that. But conversely, you can also try real hard to get all of your employees to work 5-hour days and fail at that too. It's just part of that collective human experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think when you're building a remote team or distributed team, you need to keep the social aspects of it very firmly in mind. It's not just a optimization trick for how you can hire the best people and source the best talent and produce work. There is the social interactions and the shared frame of reference and the personal relationships. And all of those things are no less valuable or important just because you don't happen to be in the same geographic location.
Thank you for summing up everything that I failed to. I appreciate that.
I'm here for you, man.
So what about ticketing? I sort of asserted earlier that more ticketing, less email, and I think there was some thought in IRC that said maybe equal. I don't know. Like what's the balance there? What do you think? I think email usually defaults to too narrow. I think people do it out of a sense of. I think partially people think, oh, I don't want to overload other people with email, but I also think like filtering is easy, especially if you channel like you use like CCs on a distribution list, sort of as a passive. But yeah, what do you think is the balance, Mark? Having been through a few orgs where you had a lot of remote.
Yeah, I just wrote in the Hangout chat, ticket or it didn't happen. I think you were right the first time. I think tickets are hugely important. But I think there needs to be a very strong sort of expectation for how those tickets are going to be treated and that it's not a black hole where questions and ideas go to die. So there also needs to be structure built into your, this goes well beyond a remote versus distributed versus all localized team. There needs to be a way for blocking work to be handled in an expeditious way that may break your sprint. And you need to think about all those issues when you're building a ticketing system. But I also think it's really important for visibility and tracking and reducing email and keeping ideas out in the open and all the things you said. You're totally right. It's important. It just requires thought and care.
Yeah, I've always been on the side of like more email, like just make CC lists so I can filter. I've often like that thing happens where like one person on the team and people on other teams were emailing about something for like a week, and then all of a sudden it gets forwarded to the list, and there's this giant thread that's got half the context, and it's like, hey, can someone else help with this? Or hey guys, we got to get this done tomorrow, and it's like, I would have much rather been included the whole time, so I could, like that goes into the bucket I look at once a day. So that's an interesting one. I think unless it's sensitive, you can default to ticketing. Okay.
I just want to make a comment on that. Ticketing systems are a fucking bike shed, so just choose one and go with it. Like, you're not going to find one that is perfect for every one of your use cases. So, like, demo a couple and then run with one. Don't sit in bike shed for forever on whether we should use Jira or whether we should use Track or whether we should use this thing over here. Just kind of try a couple, whichever one works, go with it.
Yeah, and like they're all kind of about the same. I actually really liked Bugzilla, much to most people's shock. But I think if some people don't care for the interface, wrap it in CLI tools, wrap it in a chatbot, reduce the figure out whatever friction there is to what you have, and then wrap that in some less spray some PAM on it, so to speak, and not pluggable authentication methods, because that's a horrible PAM. But reduce friction. I think is the key there. So we're about out of time. Anyone want to maybe summarize 3 key points for better remote working? It can be personal, it can be org level, whatever.
I'm going to go with asynchronous communication, get together physically when possible, and try not to get too hammered on video conference.
As one does. Mine would be everyone's got to support it, and that's like CEO and down, because if there's anyone who thinks that you can't do remote work or is anti-remote work, it could turn into a virus that could just stop it all. So, got to have all that buy-in. Everyone's got to be for it.
Mark?
Yeah, I think I echo everything that Pete and Dan said. I think the buy-in side can be relatively easy, but it's easy to get people to believe in it, and it's easy to make some very business case logical arguments in favor of it. So I think you need to be careful to understand the situation you're getting into and make sure that people buy into it. And you need to be armed with arguments to make people buy into it when they say they buy into it, but they didn't really buy into it. And you need to embrace the chat room as your office.
Okay, I'm going to pull in one from IRC, from Vincent Janelle, longtime Hangops hanger. Define personal boundaries to stop and start work. I think that's an important key one. Have that discussion, figure that out, figure out that balance, and then be consistent with it. I guess what I mean by be consistent with is like consistently deliver on whatever it is that your performance is measured against. Because ultimately that's the thing that sort of proves remote working to a major degree, right? Is like, do you continue to deliver the results that are needed for you and your place in your organization while you're remote? And if you do, then that essentially leads by example. And more and more people stay associated positively, or they overcome concerns or doubts. So I think we'll end it there. And thanks everyone for participating. We got a lot of good stuff here. Yeah, have a good weekend.
See you guys.